In January 1722, 11 ships sat at anchor in the harbor of Ouidah on the coast of West Africa. Their captains were merchants, slave traders, factors for European trading companies, men who had come to this coast for the same reason everyone came to this coast, which was money, and who expected to conduct their business and leave. They did not leave that day. On the horizon, 3 ships appeared under black flags. The captains of all 11 vessels at anchor immediately struck their colors. They did not fire their guns. They did not attempt to flee. They knew the flags. They knew the name attached to the flags. And they understood, with the specific clarity of men who had been following maritime news and maritime gossip across the Atlantic for the past 3 years, that resistance was a form of optimism they could not afford. The man commanding the incoming fleet had drummers and trumpeters playing on his deck as he entered the harbor. He had done this before. It was part of his method, the specific theater of arrival that announced not just his presence, but his confidence, his certainty that the ships he was approaching had already decided what they were going to do, and that what they were going to do was surrender. His name was Bartholomew Roberts. In 3 years of piracy, just 3 years, which is less time than it takes most men to learn a new trade, he had captured more than 400 ships, more than any pirate who had come before him, more than Blackbeard, whose name everyone knew, and Bellamy, whose cargo everyone had heard about, and Vane, who had burned his way out of Nassau Harbor rather than accept a pardon. More than all of them combined. Within weeks of that January morning in Ouidah Harbor, he would be dead. But first, he would burn one of those 11 ships with 80 people locked inside it. Both things are part of the same story. Both things are part of the same man. By 1719, the golden age of piracy was supposed to be over. Woodes Rogers had arrived in Nassau in July 1718 with a chest of royal pardons and a set of gallows, and had done what everyone said was impossible. He had broken the Republic of Pirates, scattered the flying gang, and hanged 8 men in the harbor to make sure everyone understood that the era of Nassau as a pirate sanctuary had ended. Blackbeard was dead, killed by Lieutenant Maynard off the coast of North Carolina in November 1718. Samuel Bellamy was at the bottom of the Atlantic near Cape Cod. Charles Vane, who had escaped Nassau by burning a ship, was caught and hanged in Jamaica in 1720. The Royal Navy was closing the Atlantic, year by year, port by port, commission by commission. The governments of Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal had all concluded that piracy was no longer a useful tool of commercial warfare, and had begun the systematic suppression that would, in theory, end the era entirely. The theory was correct. It was also about 3 years too slow. The Atlantic in 1719 was still the largest and least governable body of water in the world. The trade routes that crossed it were the arteries of the colonial economy: sugar from the Caribbean, silver from South America, slaves from West Africa, manufactured goods from Europe, timber and provisions from the American colonies. These routes were busy, predictable, and impossible to fully protect. A ship with enough speed, enough guns, and a captain who understood the geography of the ocean's commercial patterns could operate in that space for years before the naval vessels assigned to suppress him could catch him. The slave trade routes were particularly vulnerable. The ships that ran between West Africa and the Americas were heavy, slow, and loaded with cargo that made flight difficult. Their captains were experienced traders, not military commanders. Their crews were sometimes armed, but rarely trained for sustained combat. They were, in the calculation of a man looking for prizes, the most accessible targets on the Atlantic, valuable, predictable, and unlikely to put up effective resistance. This was the world into which Bartholomew Roberts inserted himself in 1719. The era was ending. The opportunities were shrinking. The men who had defined the Golden Age were dead or captured or reformed. And a Welsh sailor named John Roberts, 37 years old, was captured by pirates off the coast of Ghana and, within 6 weeks, became their captain. Captain Charles Johnson, whose 1724 account, A General History of the Pirates, remains the primary source for most of what we know about Roberts, described him as a tall, dark-complexioned man with a manner that suggested someone used to authority. Johnson's account, which was written within 2 years of Roberts' death and drew on testimony from men who had sailed with him, is the closest thing to a contemporary biography that exists. Its accuracy is contested by scholars on specific points, but its broad outlines have been confirmed by naval records and trial transcripts. Roberts entered a world that was contracting. He expanded it again, briefly and dramatically, before the contraction finished its work. John Roberts was born in 1682 in Pembrokeshire, in southwest Wales, the son of a landowner and farmer. This is the first thing that needs to be said about him, because it explains something that the legend of Black Bart tends to obscure. He was not born to the sea. He was not the son of a sailor or a fisherman, or a man who spent his working life on water. He came from a farming family in a county of rolling hills and stone farmhouses and market towns. A world about as far from the Atlantic as you could be and still live on an island. The sea was not his inheritance, it was his choice. He went to sea around the age of 13, common for boys of that era and class who were looking for a life outside the farms they had grown up on and the trades their fathers plied. What he did in the years between his departure from Pembrokeshire and his first appearance in any document with a date is not known. He must have sailed because he accumulated the navigational skills that would later make him valuable to both the merchant fleet and the pirate crew that captured him. He must have moved through the lower ranks of the maritime hierarchy, ordinary seaman, able seaman, mate, accumulating the competence and the authority that promotion required. By 1718, he was second mate on a ship called Princess of London, a vessel engaged in the transatlantic slave trade. The Princess transported enslaved people from the African coast to Britain. Roberts, as second mate, was a middle-ranking officer on a ship whose cargo was human beings in chains. He was not the architect of this trade, and he was not the one who made the decisions about it, but he was part of the machinery, and the machinery was what it was. This detail matters for what comes later, for the man who would burn a slave ship with 80 people locked in its hold, and for the man who would also, on multiple occasions, liberate enslaved Africans from the ships he captured and recruit them into his crew. The contradictions in Roberts's relationship to the slave trade are not resolvable with the evidence available. They are simply present, the way contradictions in real people are present, not as evidence of hypocrisy, but as evidence of a man who was shaped by his world and made choices within it that did not form a coherent moral system. In 1719, Roberts was third mate on another slave trading vessel, the Princess, operating out of Anamabo on the coast of what is now Ghana. He was 37 years old. He had been at sea for approximately 24 years. He had risen to the position of officer, but not to captain. He was, by any reasonable assessment, a competent and experienced maritime professional who had spent nearly his entire adult life working for other men in a hierarchy that rewarded reliability and punished ambition without connections. Then a pirate captain named Howell Davis arrived at Anamabo with 2 ships and changed everything. Davis was everything Roberts was not: impulsive, charismatic, operating entirely on the basis of what he could take and what he could get away with. He captured the Princess and took Roberts and several other crew members aboard his ships. Roberts, by the accounts that survive, was initially reluctant. He was not a young man making a reckless choice. He was a man in his late 30s who had built a career in the legitimate maritime world and understood what he was giving up. He gave it up anyway. Whether this was because Davis was persuasive or because 37 years of thin wages and hard labor had made the arithmetic of piracy look different, or because the specific quality of being captured and given a choice between joining and dying simplified the decision, the historical record does not say. Roberts went with Davis. He was, for 6 weeks, a junior member of a pirate crew, learning this world as he had learned every other world he had entered, by watching, calculating, and waiting for his moment. His moment came faster than anyone expected. In June 1719, Howell Davis made a mistake. The island of Principe sits in the Gulf of Guinea, about 200 kilometers off the coast of what is now Gabon. It was a Portuguese colonial possession with a governor, a garrison, and a fort. And it was the kind of place that a pirate captain needed to approach with caution, a place where hospitality and hostility could switch in the time it took to walk from the harbor to the main gate. Davis, who had successfully deceived colonial officials on multiple previous occasions, by pretending to be a naval officer or a merchant, decided to attempt the same approach on Principe. He sent word to the governor that he was a British naval vessel in need of supplies and would be honored to call upon His Excellency at the fort. The governor of Principe extended an invitation. The invitation was a trap. Davis and several of his men were ambushed on the path between the harbor and the fort. Davis was killed. The men with him were killed or scattered. The survivors ran back to the ships with the news. The pirate crew of the Royal Rover was now without a captain, in hostile waters, anchored off an island whose governor had just demonstrated a willingness to kill them, with no agreed plan and no clear succession. They voted. This was not a metaphor or a legal formality. The pirate democracy that the Articles of Agreement codified was a real operational structure, and the election of a captain from among the crew was how that structure was designed to handle exactly this situation. The crew of the Royal Rover held a vote to determine who would command them next. They chose Bartholomew Roberts. He had been among them for 6 weeks. The reasons are not entirely clear from the historical record, but the most likely explanation is the one that Johnson gives, that Roberts had distinguished himself through navigational skill and a kind of forceful intelligence that the crew recognized as the quality most useful to them in the situation they were in. He was not the most experienced pirate on the ship. He was the most competent man the crew could see. Roberts accepted the captaincy with words that have been recorded in multiple sources, including Johnson's general history, and that tell you almost everything about his character. He said, in words paraphrased from Johnson's account, that since he had dipped his hands in muddy water and must be a pirate, it was better being a commander than a common man. He was not celebrating, he was not romanticizing, he was making a calculation. The same calculation he had been making for 37 years in the legitimate maritime world, which was that the hierarchy of any institution rewarded the people at the top at the expense of the people below, and that if you were going to be in that institution, you might as well be at the top. His first act as captain was to take his crew back to Principe. They went at night. They came ashore armed. They killed a large proportion of the male population of the settlement near the harbor, and took everything of value that could be carried to the ships. The governor survived. He was in the fort, which the pirates did not have the artillery to take. But the settlement outside the fort was destroyed, and the message that Roberts sent by destroying it was the same message that would define the next 3 years of his career. He did not negotiate. He did not accept situations he considered unjust. He hit back harder than the thing that had hit him. Every time. Then, he pointed his ships at Brazil and went to find richer targets. What happened between June 1719 and February 1722 is, in terms of the sheer volume of ships taken, without parallel in the history of maritime violence. 400 ships. The number appears in every account, in every source, and it requires a moment to sit with. 400. In 32 months of active piracy, from his election as captain to his death, Bartholomew Roberts captured more ships than any other pirate in the Golden Age, more than the combined total of most of the names that history remembers as the defining figures of the era. Blackbeard, whose legend has outlasted all others, captured fewer than 50 vessels in his entire career. Roberts captured more than that in a single year, more than once. Most of them were not dramatic prizes. Most were fishing boats, coastal traders, small merchants too slow or too isolated to avoid him. But some were extraordinary, and the pattern of how he took them reveals a method that was more systematic and more intelligent than the popular image of piracy as opportunistic violence suggests. He started in Brazil. After leaving Principe in June 1719, Roberts sailed the Royal Rover across the Atlantic to the coast of Brazil, where he spent 9 frustrating weeks searching for prizes and finding nothing significant. The Portuguese convoy routes were running, but they were running in places he was not. He was about to give up and head for the Caribbean when he found them. 42 Portuguese merchant ships were anchored in the Bay of All Saints, Todos os Santos, off the coast of Bahia. The convoy was assembled for the Atlantic crossing, waiting for weather and loading final provisions. Roberts sailed the Royal Rover into the bay. He did not have the firepower to fight 42 ships at once. What he had was audacity. and the specific advantage of a man arriving among a large group of people who did not immediately understand what they were looking at. He pulled alongside one of the merchant vessels, got a captain aboard, and asked him a direct question. Which ship in this convoy is carrying the most valuable cargo? The captain pointed. Roberts took that ship. He stripped her of everything portable: gold, goods, a cargo of sugar and hides that represented months of Portuguese trade, and sailed out of the bay with his prize before the rest of the convoy could organize a response. The prize was valuable enough to justify the Atlantic crossing, and then some. Roberts had made his reputation in the Atlantic world in a single morning in a Brazilian bay. He took the Royal Rover north along the American coast. He stopped at Newfoundland in the summer of 1720, specifically at the harbor of Trepassey on the southern coast of the island, which he had learned was virtually undefended because the naval vessels assigned to guard the fishing fleets had sailed to St. John's and Placentia for provisioning. He entered Trepassey harbor with drums beating and trumpets playing, the same theatrical entrance that he would repeat at Ouida 2 years later, and found 22 ships at anchor and their crews completely unable to respond. The captains abandoned their vessels. Roberts took the ships, stripped what he wanted from each of them, burned most of what remained, and left the harbor with new ships, new guns, and a reputation that had just expanded significantly in every port along the North American seaboard. He renamed his flagship Royal Fortune, a name he would give to multiple ships over the course of his career, always trading up when a better vessel became available, always keeping the name that had served him. He armed her with 40 guns. He built a fleet around her, consort ships, smaller vessels that could pursue prey in shallow waters where the Royal Fortune could not follow. He descended on the Caribbean in the autumn of 1720 with this fleet and proceeded to demonstrate what a systematic and disciplined pirate operation could accomplish in a concentrated space. At St. Lucia, he captured 15 ships in 3 days. At Basse-Terre in St. Kitts, he sailed into the harbor flying black flags and watched every ship at anchor immediately surrender. At St. Bartholomew, the French governor, apparently deciding that cooperation was preferable to resistance, allowed Roberts and his crew to remain for several weeks to careen their ships and resupply. His methods were understood by everyone in the Atlantic world by 1721. He used local intelligence, capturing pilots and navigators who knew the routes and forcing them to share what they knew. He used false flags, approaching targets under the colors of whatever nation was least likely to cause alarm, and then revealing his own colors when it was too late for the target to flee. He used his reputation as a weapon. The black flags and the drums and the trumpets were not theater for his own enjoyment. They were instruments of surrender. They announced, before a single shot was fired, that resistance was a choice between dying for a cargo and living without it, and that the rational choice was obvious. He did not drink. This is the detail about Roberts that contemporaries found most remarkable, and it is not a trivial detail. The pirate world ran on rum. It was ration, reward, currency, and social lubricant simultaneously. A captain who did not drink was, in a specific culture of a pirate ship, an anomaly. Roberts drank tea. He dressed elaborately. The red waistcoat, the hat with the red feather, the silk sash across his chest, holding 4 pistols, the sword that he wore in formal battles, as a statement of his intent to engage personally. He ran a tight ship by the standards of the pirate world. His Articles of Agreement, recorded in Johnson's General History, prohibited gambling, prescribed specific procedures for dividing prizes, and included provisions for disability compensation that most legitimate naval services of the period did not offer. Marcus Rediker, in his study Villains of All Nations, describes Roberts as the most successful practitioner of the Atlantic pirate model, a man who took the organizational innovations of the Golden Age and deployed them with a consistency and a strategic intelligence that his contemporaries could not match. The pirate democracy worked best, Rediker argues, when the captain who operated within it was capable of providing the strategic direction that the democratic structure itself could not. Roberts was that captain. By January 1722, he had been operating for 32 months. He had captured ships on 4 coasts. He had made the Atlantic effectively ungovernable for any merchant or slaver who crossed his path. He had lost battles. The Fortune had been badly damaged in an engagement that killed 20 of his men. But he had never been caught, never been cornered for long, never faced the specific situation that Blackbeard had faced at Ocracoke Inlet in 1718, where a prepared enemy in shallow water had eliminated the tactical advantages that made him dangerous. He sailed into Ouida Harbor in January 1722 with drums beating. 11 ships struck their colors. The last act of his career was beginning. The harbor of Ouida, on the coast of what is now Benin, was, in January 1722, one of the busiest slave trading ports on the West African coast. The ships at anchor there were not merchants in the conventional sense. They were slave ships, vessels whose business was the purchase of human beings from African coastal traders and the transportation of those people across the Atlantic to the colonial labor markets of the Americas. The captains of those ships were experienced men, hardened by the specific violence of their trade, not easily frightened. They were frightened when Bartholomew Roberts arrived. He came in with 3 ships, the Royal Fortune, the Ranger, and the Little Ranger, all flying black flags. The 11 ships in the harbor struck their colors immediately, which was the standard response to a pirate fleet of that size in those waters, and which was also, for every captain watching from his deck, a calculation about the cost of resistance. Roberts had a reputation that preceded him by months and miles. He had been operating on the West African coast since the spring of 1721. Every captain in the harbor knew the name. Every captain in the harbor made the same decision. Roberts anchored. He sent word to the assembled fleet that his terms were simple: 8 pounds of gold dust per ship, and every captain would have his vessel restored. The gold dust was a specific demand, calibrated to the currency of the West African coastal trade. 8 pounds per ship from 11 ships was 88 pounds of gold dust. A substantial sum, but not an impossible one. Roberts had done the calculation. 10 captains paid. The 11th was a man named Francis Fern, captain of a vessel whose name varies across the sources. He refused. Whether this was principle or poverty or some specific dispute with Roberts' terms that the surviving accounts do not preserve, the record does not say. What the record says is that Fern refused to pay, and that Roberts responded to this refusal with a speed and a totality that removed any ambiguity about what non-compliance meant. Roberts ordered his men aboard Fern's ship. They poured tar over the vessel. They set it on fire. There were 80 enslaved Africans locked in the hold. Some of them jumped overboard when the fire started. Some of them drowned. Some were taken by sharks. Some burned. The accounts differ on the specific numbers and the specific fates, but they agree on the essential fact. The 80 people in the hold of Fern's ship did not survive the morning of January 1722 in Ouida Harbor. They died because one captain refused a pirate's terms, and the pirate had decided that the cost of making an example was acceptable. Roberts watched it happen. He was on the deck of the Royal Fortune, in his red waistcoat with the feathered hat and the 4 pistols on his silk sash, watching a ship burn in a harbor full of ships that had already decided not to be this ship. This is the moment that defines the difficulty of Bartholomew Roberts as a historical subject. He is, by any objective measure of the metric he is measured by, the most successful pirate who ever lived. He is also a man who watched 80 human beings die in a fire because their captain would not pay him gold dust. Both of these things are true. They are true about the same man, in the same harbor, on the same morning. Roberts left Ouida with his gold dust and his prizes and his reputation intact. He sailed north along the coast to Cape Lopez in what is now Gabon, where he intended to prepare his ships for a voyage to Brazil. He had been moving for 3 years. He had no particular reason to believe that Cape Lopez would be different from everywhere else he had stopped. He did not know that Captain Challoner Ogle of HMS Swallow had been assigned to find him, and that Ogle was already on his way. Challoner Ogle is the forgotten man of the Bartholomew Roberts story. Roberts gets the legend: the 400 ships, the red waistcoat, the drums and trumpets, the flag with his own image on it. Ogle gets a footnote. This is a function of how history distributes its attention, toward the brilliant transgressor and away from the competent authority that eventually catches the brilliant transgressor. But Ogle was not simply the instrument of a foregone conclusion. He was a skilled naval commander, operating with inadequate resources against a man who had proved impossible to catch for 3 years. And what he did at Cape Lopez in February 1722 required the specific kind of intelligence that the legend of Black Bart tends to obscure. Chaloner Ogle was in his early 30s in 1722, a career naval officer who had served in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, and who had been assigned to the West African coast with HMS Swallow, a 50-gun ship, and a mission that amounted to finding and eliminating the most successful pirate operating in the Atlantic world. The problem was that Roberts had more guns. The Royal Fortune carried 40 cannon, and Roberts had 2 consort ships, the Ranger and the Little Ranger, for a combined armament of 72 guns. The Swallow had 50. A direct engagement, ship to ship, was not a guaranteed British victory. It was not even an obvious one. Roberts' crew was experienced, well-armed, and had spent 3 years fighting the kind of engagement that would have given them a significant advantage over a naval crew that had been weakened by the diseases of the West African coast. Ogle understood this. He did not approach Cape Lopez looking for a direct confrontation on Roberts' terms. He approached it looking for a way to disaggregate the problem, to separate the 3 pirate ships and take them one at a time rather than face the combined fleet simultaneously. He found his opportunity in the geography of the Cape and in a specific piece of human nature that applies as reliably to pirates as to anyone else. On February 5, 1722, Ogle's HMS Swallow appeared off Cape Lopez. Roberts' fleet was at anchor, the Royal Fortune, the Ranger, and the Little Ranger, all present. Roberts was aboard the Royal Fortune. The Ranger, commanded by a captain named James Skirm, was closest to the open water. Ogle veered away. The specific maneuver was calculated to look like a merchant ship attempting to flee. The standard response of a vessel that has spotted a pirate fleet and is trying to escape before being overtaken. The pirates on the Ranger, seeing what appeared to be a fleeing merchant, did exactly what 3 years of successful piracy had trained them to do. They gave chase. The Ranger pursued HMS Swallow out of sight of Cape Lopez. When they were far enough from the anchorage that the Royal Fortune could not see what was happening, Ogle turned the Swallow around and fought the Ranger on his own terms, with a fully prepared crew and the advantage of a ship that was larger and more heavily armed than its pursuer. The engagement was decisive. The Ranger was taken. Captain Skirm survived, wounded. Many of his crew were killed or captured. Ogle took the Ranger back to a safe anchorage, left a prize crew aboard her, and turned the Swallow back toward Cape Lopez. Roberts, on the Royal Fortune, had seen the Ranger leave and had not seen her return. He did not know what had happened. He was, by several accounts, drinking tea and eating breakfast when the Swallow appeared again off the Cape on the morning of February 10th. Bartholomew Roberts died as he had lived, in his red waistcoat, with his 4 pistols on their silk sash across his chest, on the deck of a ship he had named Royal Fortune. He was at breakfast when HMS Swallow appeared off Cape Lopez. Most of his crew were in various states of recovery from the celebrations that had followed their success at Ouida, drunk, hungover, or still asleep below decks. Roberts himself was sober, as he always was. He understood immediately what he was looking at. He had been evading naval vessels for 3 years. He recognized the silhouette of a Royal Navy warship, and he recognized that the Ranger was not visible anywhere in the anchorage, and he understood that the absence of the Ranger was significant in a way that required urgent attention. He did not run. He could have. The Royal Fortune was a fast ship, and the coast of Gabon had inlets and shallow waters where a lighter vessel could go that a 50-gun naval ship could not easily follow. Flight was an option. Roberts had used it before, when the arithmetic of engagement was not in his favor. He chose to fight instead. Whether this was because he calculated that he could win, or because something in the way the morning had assembled itself, the fog, the specific configuration of ships, the absence of the Ranger, the state of his crew, told him that the mathematics had finally closed around him, and that running would simply delay the inevitable. The historical record does not fully explain. What it records is that Roberts ordered the anchor up, the sails unfurled, and the Royal Fortune brought to a course that would take her past the Swallow, and, if everything went as it needed to go, out into open water where his speed might carry him clear. everything did not go as it needed to go. HMS Swallow fired a broadside of grape shot, small iron balls packed together in a casing that scattered on impact, designed not to destroy a ship but to kill the men on its deck. Roberts was standing on the quarterdeck, directing the action, when the grape shot hit him. The ball, or possibly several balls, struck him in the throat. He fell against the ropes of the mizzenmast. He was dead before his body reached the deck. His crew, those who were sober enough to fight, continued the engagement for some time after Roberts fell. They did not know yet, in the smoke and the noise of the battle, that their captain was dead. When they understood what had happened, the will to continue collapsed quickly. The Royal Fortune struck her colors. The most successful pirate in the history of the Golden Age of piracy had been killed in a battle that lasted less than 2 hours by grape shot from a 50-gun naval vessel whose captain had been clever enough to separate his fleet and take it one ship at a time. Roberts had prepared for this possibility. In conversations and in the articles that governed his crew, he had made his wishes about his death known, that he was not to be taken alive, and that his body was not to fall into British hands. His crew, even in the chaos of surrender, honored this. Before Ogle's men could board the Royal Fortune and claim Roberts as a prize, his crew threw his body overboard. He went into the water off Cape Lopez in the Gulf of Guinea, fully dressed in his red waistcoat and his hat with the red feather and his silk sash and his 4 pistols. He was 40 years old. Challoner Ogle did not find the body. He had his victory, the Royal Fortune, the Ranger, the surviving crew, the evidence of 3 years of piracy that would fill the court records at Cape Coast Castle for months. He did not have the man. Roberts had managed, in the end, the one thing he had been managing since June 1719. He had chosen his own terms, and the sea had kept them. They brought the survivors to Cape Coast Castle. The fort stands on a promontory on the coast of what is now Ghana, a whitewashed Portuguese construction that had passed through Dutch and then British hands, now operating as the headquarters of the Royal African Company and, on the occasion of April 1722, as the site of the largest piracy trial in history. 272 men from the crews of Roberts' fleet were brought before the court. The proceedings were thorough and methodical and took several weeks. The court records, preserved in the British National Archives, provide the most detailed picture we have of who the men who sailed with Roberts actually were. Their ages, their origins, their accounts of how they had come to be on a pirate ship in the Gulf of Guinea in 1722. The picture that emerges is not the one that popular legend tends to provide. The crew of Bartholomew Roberts was not a gathering of hardened criminals and professional villains. It was a cross-section of the maritime working class of the early 18th century. Men who had been pressed into service, or coerced into joining, or captured from merchant vessels and given the choice between a berth and a plank, or who had calculated, as Roberts himself had calculated in 1719, that the mathematics of piracy compared favorably to the mathematics of honest maritime employment. Among the defendants were musicians, men who had been taken from merchant ships and forced to play the drums and trumpets that Roberts used as his instrument of psychological intimidation. Their defense was that they had been compelled, that they had asked to leave and been refused, that their presence on the Royal Fortune was not voluntary. The court found some of these arguments convincing, others it did not. 72 men were sentenced to death. 52 were hanged at Cape Coast Castle in a ceremony that was designed to be witnessed. The colonial authorities understood that the spectacle of the sentence was part of the deterrent, and they arranged the executions accordingly. The bodies were left in chains on gibbets along the coast, visible from passing ships, for months afterward. The youngest of the executed was Joseph Moore of Wiltshire, aged 19. The oldest was Richard Harris of Cornwall, aged 45. 20 men had their death sentences commuted to 7 years of indentured labor in the mines of West Africa, a commutation that was, in practical terms, a delayed death sentence. The climate, the disease, and the conditions of the mines meant that few men serving that sentence survived it. 77 Africans who had been part of Roberts' crew, men he had liberated from slave ships over the course of his career, who had sailed with him and fought alongside his crew, were returned to chains. The court had no category for a freed slave who had become a pirate. It returned them to the condition from which Roberts had taken them. They were sold back into the slave trade. Challoner Ogle was knighted. Sir Challoner Ogle. The carved coconut shell that had been in Roberts' possession when he died, an artifact of uncertain origin and uncertain significance, was given to Ogle as a trophy of his victory, along with other items recovered from the royal fortune. Ogle commissioned from it a drinking cup decorated with silver, which is preserved today in the collection of the Royal Museum's Greenwich in London. It is the only physical object from Bartholomew Roberts' life and career that has a confirmed provenance and a known location. The death of Bartholomew Roberts is considered by most historians of the period to mark the effective end of the golden age of piracy. Not because his death changed anything structural about the Atlantic world that had produced him, but because no one of comparable capability or reach emerged after him. The suppression that had been closing around the pirate world since 1718, since Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau and Blackbeard was killed off North Carolina, finally had no significant opponent left. The last man who had found a way to operate at scale in the closing Atlantic had been killed by grape shot off the coast of Gabon and thrown into the water by his own crew before the Navy could claim him. Marcus Rediker, in Villains of All Nations, described Roberts as the culmination of the Golden Age's specific organizational logic, the point at which the pirate democratic model had been pushed as far as it could go by a captain skilled enough to make it work consistently. After Roberts, there was no one who combined the strategic intelligence, the operational consistency, and the specific willingness to operate at that scale. The era ended not because anyone killed it, though people tried, but because the man who had been sustaining it was dead. A General History of the Pirates, published by Captain Charles Johnson in 1724, 2 years after the trial at Cape Coast Castle, gave Roberts more pages than any other pirate in the book. It described his career with a combination of horror and admiration that has characterized most writing about him since. Johnson could not quite decide whether Roberts was a monster or a genius, or both, and settled for describing him as both and leaving the judgment to the reader. Most readers have done the same. He did not want to be a pirate. This is the thing that the legend of Black Bart tends to overlook, because legends do not require their subjects to have had alternative plans. But Roberts was 37 years old when Howell Davis captured him off the coast of Ghana. He had been at sea for 24 years. He had worked his way up through the ranks of the legitimate maritime world to the position of officer. Not captain, but officer. And he had done it slowly, and by the standards available to a farmer's son from Pembrokeshire who had left home at 13 with no connections and no money and only the skill he could accumulate. He had not accumulated enough. The maritime world of the early 18th century did not offer easy paths from ordinary origins to command. The captaincies went to men with connections, with capital, with the right social relationships in the right port cities. Roberts had skill and nothing else. And skill alone, in that world, produced officers who served under other men for their entire careers. He was captured by pirates. He was given a choice. He took the choice that offered what the legitimate world had withheld: command, autonomy, a share of the proceeds commensurate with the risk, a vote in the decisions that determined his fate. He was better at it than anyone who had come before him. His motto, as recorded by Johnson, was that a merry life and a short one was his preference. He said this early in his career, before he knew how short the short would be. He died at 40. He had been a pirate for 3 years. He had been a legitimate sailor for 24. The 3 years eclipsed the 24 in every account ever written about him, which is itself a statement about what the world notices and what it overlooks. The 400 ships, the red waistcoat, the drums and the trumpets, the tea, the flag with his own image on it, standing over the skulls of the governors who had made his life difficult. The body thrown into the Gulf of Guinea before the Navy could take it. He made his choice with his eyes open, knowing what it cost, knowing how it ended. He said so himself. The short life was the price of the merry one, and he accepted the terms. What this says about the world that produced him, about the thin wages and the hard labor, and the hierarchy that rewarded birth over skill, and connections over competence, is something that the trial records at Cape Coast Castle and the gibbets along the Guinea coast and the knighthood of Challoner Ogle do not address. The world that hanged 52 of his crew and sold 77 Africans back into slavery had no interest in examining the conditions that had made Roberts's calculations seem reasonable to several hundred men who had made the same calculation and ended up sailing under his flag. He was somebody's son. He had a name before it was a legend. John Roberts, from Pembrokeshire, third mate on a slave ship, captured at 37 and dead at 40. He captured 400 ships. Nobody stopped him until they did. The cup made from his coconut shell is still in the collection at Greenwich. The body went into the water off Cape Lopez and has not been found. Some things the sea keeps.